my pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues from the University of Maryland Perry School of Law, Amanda Putilnik, who also is a faculty member at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Harvard Law School. She has published extensively on issues of neuroscience in the law, including a number of interests at the intersection of chronic and acute pain detection, memory detection, and models of mind in criminal law. Most recently, she was named the inaugural Senior Fellow in Law and Applied Neuroscience at Harvard's Law School in the Patrick Helm Center, and we're looking forward to her talk today. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Leslie. Turn this on. And hearing somebody's cell phone reminds me that I should turn off my phone, and if you'd like to do the same, you don't have to, you're welcome to. Leslie, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very honored to be speaking at the Berman Center here today, the work of which I have admired for a very long time, and I'm particularly looking forward to speaking with fellows this afternoon and learning about their work too. Today I am going to talk about mind reading, or really brain reading. What we currently can and can't do, what may be coming down the line, and what some of the legal implications will be of these new technologies. The law has been interested in trying to read minds for about as long as it has existed, or at least as long as it has existed in a modern form, with trials and interrogations that depended on something other than claims of divine favor. So in the Middle Ages and through the early Renaissance, the law depended upon indications of God's favor to determine whether a person was truthful or not, virtuous or not. And so we had the idea of trial by ordeal. If you throw the suspected witch into a pool of water, a mark of perhaps demonic possession or demonic association would be that she floats, and a mark of divine favor would be that she sinks. She might drown to death, but at least her soul is going to heaven. Trial by combat was also the idea of trial by ordeal, that divine favor would indicate to us who is virtuous or not. But as we moved away from the idea of trial by ordeal, we came to emphasize trial by evidence of what people know or don't know. Are they being truthful? The truthfulness of the defendant, him or herself, and the witnesses has been a primary concern since about the 1700s, or really the 1600s. Originally, and we'll all be glad that we moved on from this too, one of the ideas about how to elicit truth was that a person would only be truthful against his or her own interests under extreme pain, and therefore torture was a primary method for trying to determine whether or not a person was being truthful. The notion was the more pain you inflict upon somebody, the less likely they are to be able to lie. And so torture was viewed as a necessary, indeed, an essential tool of the investigator for producing and inquiring into the truth, particularly the truth of the defendant. Witnesses weren't tortured, typically, unless they were unwilling to cooperate. And indeed, our own Fifth Amendment to the Constitution has its roots in part in the rejection of torture as a method for seeking truth. The privilege against self-incrimination is in part protection against torture or other forms of coercion designed to produce truth. So what have we done to try to produce truth since we abandoned the ideas of trial by ordeal and investigation through torture, truth of pain? Nothing very effective. We've had everything from phrenology to polygraph, and none of them have done very much for us. As I'm sure you're all familiar, and there was recently a wonderful profile in the New Yorker, one of the early inventors of a polygraph machine was also a fiction writer who's the progenitor of the Wonder Woman character. You know, Wonder Woman has this lasso of truth, and the lasso of truth is this holy grail of legal investigation. We are still trying to create. So what are we doing now? There are some new technologies that do promise to be better than the polygraph, better than the investigator who can stare into your eyes and peer into your soul and say, I know whether you're telling the truth or not. But they're not yet Wonder Woman's lasso of truth. So we're going to take a look today at what it means to try to read the mind for legal purposes, then what are the two leading technologies that are showing promise for mind reading or brain reading, and then finally, what are the major legal implications of these technologies. So, I'm sorry, there appears to be volume on here. I'd like to turn off the volume on the slides. Could you somebody show me how to do that? I apologize for the interruption. Okay, so first we'll take a quick look at what is mind reading or brain reading. What do I mean when I say that? Then what are the technologies? We're going to focus on EEG and fMRI. And then finally, what are some of the legal implications? I'll particularly be focusing on the legal implications at the intersection of criminal law and constitutional law, particularly the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. So what do I mean when I say mind reading or brain reading? Primarily information or memory detection. So does this particular brain have certain information stored in it? If 2 hours from now I want to know what was available for lunch here, can I read Leslie Henry's brain and figure out whether there was a cold sandwich buffet or a hot lasagna buffet? And will her brain have encoded that information? The second is deception detection, which is a bit different. If I ask her, what did you have for lunch? Is her response honest or dishonest? These are fundamentally two different tasks, and they require different forms of investigation. This is basically the difference between honesty versus accuracy. And finally, and I'm not going to talk as much about this one, we could speak of brain reading in terms of affect detection. How does this person feel? So three basic categories. One, has this brain stored particular information? If it has stored particular information, can I access the information that it has stored? The second is this person being honest or deceptive? Regardless of whether they're being accurate, are they telling me what they believe to be the truth when they answer my questions? And third, how is this person feeling? If she says that she feels calm, does she actually feel anxious? Can I measure somebody's mood or affect? So the first category is information detection. What do I mean by information detection? The theory behind information detection is that the brain encodes information, and if it encodes information, we ought to, in principle, be able to decode the information. Very much like reading a hard drive. Now, we have heard probably, and you're probably familiar with this for many years, that the brain does not really store a video-like recording or tape recording-like recording of information. And that's partly true, but to some extent it is possible to read back the tape of what a person's brain has encoded very much in the same way that you could read back a videotape. I'm going to talk for just a moment about memory, encoding, and storage. Memory is a dynamic process. Memory is in flux all the time, and it can be inaccurate in a whole variety of ways. So we're sitting here right now, and what you encode from today very much depends on what you are paying attention to. This is both a conscious and an unconscious process. Your conscious brain may be telling you, pay attention to the speaker, I came here to see the speaker, I need to pay attention to her, or whatever conscious narrative you're using to direct your attention. Unconsciously, your brain has a lifetime of experience in telling you what cues are salient in your environment versus not. And so what is salient to Alan may be a little bit different than what is salient to Karen or to Leslie based on their life experiences and their interests. And then there are some things that are salient to us more or less universally as human beings. Food is salient to all of us. You would all remember that there was food here. And usually something about gender and sexual availability is going to be salient to all of us on sort of subconscious amygdala level, so you're going to be picking up on things like that. And whether or not that you remember there are red poinsettias in the back of the room will have to do with your level of interest and where you were sitting. But none of us will have a perfect and identical map of everything that happened in this room. So we're all selectively encoding certain things depending upon our conscious attention and our subconscious attention and life experiences. The idea behind memory detection is that, at least to the imperfect extent that you have encoded what goes on today, we should be able to pick up some of that information. There are challenges with that, though. Everything that you encode degrades over time. And what is important to you about what happened today, if anything, may be very different a week or a month or a year from now than an hour from now. It may turn out that something that happens in this room today is triggered and reinforced a week from now, and then that takes on disproportionate or greater significance in your memory. And then when you recall the memory, that's going to be much more locally front of mind than the rest of it. So our memories, although I've used the computer hard drive analogy, are much more like writable files than read-only files. Every time we recall a memory, we are, in some sense, changing it through recalling it, and we are rewriting it every time we recall it. This leads to the paradoxical or somewhat counterintuitive finding that the more often you remember or recall a particular memory, the less reliable it is likely to be. This is worth thinking as the holidays come up for all of us. Our core family stories about ourselves and what your little brother or your mom did to you when you were 6 that was tremendously unfair, that you thought about your whole life, or that was tremendously wonderful. Those narratives are some of our least accurate memories. It's the memory that remains, in a sense, preserved in amber like a fly, that you haven't thought of in years and years and haven't had that many opportunities to rewrite through recall. There are some of your more accurate memories. So when we try to detect information in the brain, it's important to understand that the information is encoded at time 1, but reinforced differently at times 2, 3, 7, umpteen, 35. And therefore, it's changing and it's dynamic all the time. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to determine what information your brain is storing, but it does mean that the information I recall or read from your brain about what happened today, may be different than the information that I could detect from your brain a year from now or 2 years from now. Yes?
A quick question. Is there a difference between, I've heard, said that traumatic memories are different, or, I'm wondering if the same applies in thinking about the law of being a participant in or observing a traumatic memory or image that then becomes a memory. Is it changed in the same way?
That's a very active and very controversial area of research. There are, with a tremendously broad span of points of view, there are researchers whose careers are built around the idea that traumatic memories are different, and that some traumatic memories are so traumatic that they bypass conscious recall and are stored in ways that are profoundly physical and that can be triggered through certain kinds of physical touch or physical programming. There are other researchers, foremost among them Elizabeth Loftus, who argue that traumatic memory, although it feels different when you recall it from a positive memory, is not fundamentally stored in different ways. Certainly traumatic memories have heightened emotion and heightened salience for the person who experienced them. But the idea that traumatic memory bypasses the conscious mind and is repressed and needs to be recalled has, I think, come into significant doubt in the last 10 to 15 years in particular. And I'll be happy to talk. I actually have a couple of slides on that. Oh, no, not at all. I'm happy to take questions as I go. So information detection. What does this brain have stored in it? We'll talk a little about technologies for information detection. Now, information detection is different from deception detection. Typically in the past, when the law has tried to do mind reading, it has tried to do deception detection, lie detection, not information reading. Deception detection is that a Coca-Cola that you're drinking, and I ask you to tell me the truth and then then tell me a lie. No, it's a sprite. And then I measure physiologically what are the differences in your physical state, your brain state, between when you give me the truthful response versus the deceptive response. And when, and then subtract, in effect, the truthful response from the deceptive response. And whatever is left in between are supposed to be the signatures or the hallmarks of deception. Information detection is different because information detection doesn't rely on the idea that the person is dissembling in any way. It's just an assay. Does this brain have this information in it? Deception detection, is this person being honest? Can I tell the difference between a truth and a falsehood? Of course, being honest is different from being accurate. We are all honestly wrong a lot of the time. And probably more often than not. And the more you study, the more I've studied about memory, the more frightening it is, and the less I trust my own recall of anything. Those of us in law, and maybe in your fields as well, have become increasingly aware of how often eyewitnesses are mistaken. They honestly believe, yes, I saw the gentleman in the blue sweater with the white beard sitting 4 rows back, taking diligent notes. But by the time we are identifying that person, it's an amalgam of who I actually saw, with who I think I saw, with my memories of other people I've seen in the interim, with my social preconceptions of who it is I think I would have seen performing that kind of action. And so memory, experience, and bias all become agglomerated together to make people frequently honest but quite inaccurate. So deception detection is very important for certain kinds of legal tasks where we think a person might consciously lie, but it is not a very good way of determining if a person is being accurate instead of honest. So this is a big problem with false and recovered memories, particularly in the legal system, because it's an open question whether there is such a thing as a repressed and recovered memory. People who have experienced recovered memories experience them as genuine. However, that emotional certainty, which would pass an effective lie detector test as it being an honest memory, doesn't verify its accuracy. And I wish I could tell you that one of the upshots of this talk is that there is now a brain-based technology for separating an honest but false memory from an honest but true memory, but we definitely don't have that yet. Now, the theory of the polygraph, the lie detector machine, is that people become somewhat more anxious when they lie, that people are relatively calmer when they tell the truth, and relatively more anxious when they lie, because when they lie, they are concerned about being found out. That's not actually particularly accurate. If you have good reasons to be calm about the truth, and I'm asking you truthful information that is not anxiety-provoking, and then I ask you to lie about it, and you are the kind of person who is afraid of getting found out, then there can be a measurable state change from honesty to dishonesty. But that was a lot of caveats, wasn't it? What if I ask you to tell me truthful information that you're very anxious about? And then I ask you to lie about something, but you're not an anxious liar. You're a practiced and habitual liar. Well, then your signatures are going to be very different. And so the polygraph has never been particularly accurate. This is a little sidebar. Do you know what the most accurate use of the polygraph is that I'm aware of? You have a machine that may or may not be a polygraph. You don't even turn it on. You tell some suspect that it's a machine that's 100% accurate. You hook him up to it, and then because of his anxiety, he just tells you the truth. And that's not a machine function. That's a clever or deceptive or scurrilous technique, depending on your perspective. Now, the theory of brain-based lie detection is a little bit more sophisticated. The theory is that an honest answer, again, not necessarily an accurate answer, but an honest answer is automatic. That if you have certain information encoded in your brain and I ask you for it, you can't suppress it. You can suppress saying it, but that there is what is called a prepotent neurological response that is triggered preconsciously, several hundred milliseconds before you are even aware that the information has occurred to you. That your conscious awareness of information is somewhat post hoc. So if I ask Leslie, what's your name? Unless she's in an extremely compromised, situation, that's just going to occur. Or to you, or if I ask you, is the sky blue? The answer is right there. But if you need to generate a non-truthful answer, your brain has to do a little bit of extra work. It has to do extra work of two forms. It has to suppress the correct response so that you don't blurt it out, and it has to come up with something else. And that extra work is instantiated in extra mental processes, and that those extra mental processes will be visible. And further, these extra mental processes would be universal across everybody with a typically functioning brain, and has nothing to do with anxiety, and has nothing to do with whether the truth is going to hurt or harm you, hurt or help you, or whether you're an anxious liar or not an anxious liar, because if you ask me where am I today, and I have every incentive in the world either to say or not to say Johns Hopkins, the information's in my brain, and my brain is going to preconsciously say Johns Hopkins, in effect say Johns Hopkins, before I suppress it. And so the theory is that brain-based deception detection ought to be more accurate than the polygraph, which picks up these very contingent peripheral physical signals. Now, it is worth mentioning, though, that there are a lot of ways to be deceptive. Deception isn't just making up new information. It could be making up new information. You ask me, what's my name? And I say, I'm Zaphod Beeblebrox, president for Life of the Galaxies is a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I had to make up some information. But I can also use true existing information selectively. So brain-based lie detection is not yet, it's good at detecting this kind of thing. What you have to do when you make up new information is suppress the existing information, and you do the mental work to make up something new. But a sophisticated liar will usually relate something that's autobiographically true in a way that is misleading or deceptive. I think we've all probably experienced that it's possible to deceive using truthful information depending on how you relate it. So just as memory is not a wholly stable concept, deception is not a wholly stable concept. So when we talk about memory or information detection, we need to be precise about what it is we think we're detecting. And when we talk about deception detection, we need to be precise about what kinds of deceptions we're talking about. And that becomes important for the ways in which technologies can access them. Okay, now let's take a look at some of the technologies themselves. The two major technologies that I'm going to talk about are EEG and fMRI. So EEG is electroencephalogram. There were lots of pictures available online, but I thought this baby was adorable. Presumably, she is not lying or under criminal investigation. But this just shows a typical array of electrode detectors that are typically glued to the surface of the head, and these, even though this is a large array, there are billions of neurons and trillions of synapses in the brain. So what each one of these nodes is detecting is the aggregate activity of tens of thousands of neurons superficially in the cortex. It's group activity. So when clusters of neurons fire together, that produces characteristic EEG signatures. So EEG measures the ongoing electrical activity of the brain, and it can detect changes in brain activity across brain regions and across different types of stimuli. So you take a base state, and you can read the base state or resting state of the brain, and then you can give the person a stimulus, and you can look for a change in the response to the stimulus. We can look for what are called event potentials, is something happening in the brain, and evoked reaction potentials. I give you a stimulus, and you react to it, so I'm evoking your reaction. Those are called ERPs. To use EEG to detect deception, we give the person, who is the subject of the investigation, a prompt. So what are we looking for? We're looking for evoked reaction potentials. matches. And let's go to the next one. This is a little diagram of what an ERP looks like. We have this pre-stimulus period where we're just tracking aggregate electrical activity in a particular region of a person's brain. And it looks fairly spiky, and we average it. When you average all those trials together over time, you get a relatively smooth line. And then when I give you the stimulus against that average, you see a variation that, against the average, this looks artificially large. That's what makes it relatively clear. So here the person is listening to a tone, and we can see this is the response that we get 700 milliseconds later when the person perceives the tone. With deception detection, the theory is that, I'll go back to this slide. You're sitting here thinking about not very much in particular, or looking at not very much in particular. Maybe you're looking at that gray wall, and that shiny wall. And I flash up a picture of something that looks relevant to you. And let's imagine now that you are the chair of the Nestle Life Corporation that makes this pure life water, and you're trying to figure out your new ad campaign. Should your labels look like this, or should they be different? And I flash up a big picture of this label on the wall over there. When you see that, you're going to recognize it, and that recognition is going to produce a different pattern of brain activity than the not very much that was going on when you were just staring at that gray shiny wall. And that recognition, aha, yeah, I know that image, evokes what is called a P300 wave. It's called P300 because it peaks at about 300 milliseconds after you perceive the stimulus. And it turns out, this is based on research going back to the 1950s, that when a person sees something that is familiar and salient to them, there is this P300 response that produces a characteristic wave form. So if I don't know what you're looking at, I'm the researcher, I'm now blinded to what you're looking at that screen. And I, or my research assistant, just looking at printouts from the EEG machine, I can tell by looking at that, are you looking at an image of something that is familiar and salient to you, or are you looking at something that is not familiar and salient to you? And then we can go back and say, oh, what is it that was familiar to Professor Rothenberg? And how strong was her response? So this has been used in laboratories for not since the 50s, but probably since the 70s, with varying degrees of success, but increasing degrees of refinement, to test people on what's called a guilty knowledge test. So the laboratory construction of this is, I take my subject, Professor Rothenberg, I hope you don't mind, you're going to be my subject for this, and this crime is going to be called the purloined point setup. I bring her into this room, and she sees those 2 poinsettia plants in the back, ask her to take one. And she takes one into the other room. She has now committed the perfect crime. And I've put Professor Henry in another room, and I've asked her to lift and put down something else that's a similar size and shape, but it's not a poinsettia plant. One of them has the guilty knowledge of the crime, but I don't know which one. I hook them up to the EEG array, and I show them pictures of poinsettia plants. Now, Professor Henry has certainly seen a poinsettia plant in her life. She may have a very mild P300 response. Professor Rothenberg is going to have a really strong one, particularly if it's recent. So this has been developed into the idea that if you show the criminal or the suspect information that only the criminal would know from only the crime scene, then their brain is going to give them away. They don't have to say a word. They don't have to invoke their Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. You're not even asking them a question. You're not even hooking them up to a polygraph and I'm not asking Professor Rothenberg, did you steal the poinsettia? She doesn't have to say yes or no. It's just, is her brain giving me a P300 response or not? And I should be able to tell one way or another. Now, this has been used in India in the criminal justice system. And a couple of years ago, a woman was convicted of murder. convicted of murdering her husband because, based on the results of a P300 protocol, where she apparently produced this characteristic brain signature in response to the sight of a photograph of a vial of poison that was used to murder her husband. The Indian Supreme Court ultimately reversed her conviction and said that a person may not be forcibly subjected to an EEG-based test, but left the door open for the voluntary use of the test. At first blush, that sounds like an appropriate balancing of the power of the state versus the right of the defendant. If the defendant wanted to prove she's innocent, she can say, "Hook me up to the machine. I'm going to show you that I won't respond to this." However, there are a few problems with that. One, the test is not so accurate, so you get a bad result. The second is lots of things are familiar to us for lots of reasons. By the time she was given this test, she knew what the police were claiming her husband was poisoned with, and the vial of poison was a very, very common form of rat poison, and rats are very common in India, and she had surely bought this kind of product many times in her life. So she would have responded to it, regardless of whether she had used it to poison him. Third, investigators can contaminate the subject by feeding them information. We're all aware of the problems with suggestion in police-led questioning that sometimes leads to false confessions, much less false brain scans. And finally, if a defendant is allowed to take this test, what do you think your inference would be as a juror if they declined to do so? So availability can creep very quickly into a negative presumption, a kind of an unofficial or de facto mandatory usage. So there are a couple of commercial companies. One of them's gone out of business. The one was called No Lie MRI that uses MRI, and the other was called the Kifos Corporation, from the Greek for head, that was offering EEG-based lie detection and was claiming that their protocol was 99% accurate, but because they were protecting it as a trade secret, it wasn't subject to peer review. And so it's not clear how good their results really were. Critics say it's not that good, but there is reason to believe that it's getting better, particularly in combination with certain other complementary technologies. So, yes, there are false positives and salients, as I was just discussing. That depending on what you know, you may respond quite strongly to something that doesn't actually incriminate you. And there can also be countermeasures. You can see a probe, but think about something else, just as there are countermeasures to the polygraph. We also don't understand how drugs, alcohol, and memory decay, the ordinary processes of memory decay, affect the P300 wave. And we don't understand how false certainty can affect it. So this may not be useful in detecting the difference between a true memory and a false memory. Let's say you've come to believe because let's say you were subjected to hypnosis by a well-meaning but misinformed therapist. And through hypnosis, you have recovered memories of horrific satanic abuse you suffered as a child. There are cases where this has happened. Those memories may feel as or even more real to you than something you experienced, and when you see the image of the pentagram that you claim was drawn on your friend's face at the daycare center where you were all ritualistically satanically abused, you may produce that very strong P300 wave. But the P300 is not only not a dead letter, it's a very active area of investigation. So a corporation called Veritas Scientific is developing something called friend or foe technology. I think one of the questions is this technology itself our friend or our foe? The friend or foe algorithm is intended for use in the field, particularly in military situations, to determine whether a person is a hostile or non-hostile. So the Veritas Corporation has developed something that looks like a motorcycle helmet. I wish I had a photo for you, but Veritas itself has not released a photo of the device. So it looks like a motorcycle helmet with a visor. And there are hundreds of little metal brush-like sensors that go through your hair touch your scalp in the way that electrodes would in an EEG array in the lab. And on the visor that comes down in front of your eyes, images are flashed to see if you produce a recognition wave or not. The way Veritas is promoting the use of this technology is to the US military and suggesting that if you need to figure out who in a village in Afghanistan is likely to be a friend or foe, or who on the Iraqi police force or in the Iraqi military is likely to be a friend or a foe, you can put this helmet on them and flash images of known terrorists or highly detailed information about how to make an IED. The founder of the company, named Eric Elwood, said, well, we wouldn't show somebody a picture of an IED, an improvised explosive device, because anybody working in Iraqi or Afghani military or law enforcement would have seen one, so we're not getting useful information that way. But if we show somebody a brief image of some highly specialized component that you would only be familiar with if you were a bomb maker, and you have a response to that, that's a real signal. It doesn't tell us 100% you are a foe, but it says, ah, this guy, there might be something about this guy. Let's find out more about him. And similarly, you know, we are all going to recognize the face of Osama bin Laden at this point. I think we've all seen his picture and his videos hundreds and thousands of times. But if there's somebody who's less well known, who's not a media celebrity terrorist, and you recognize his face, maybe I'd like to talk to you a little bit more. So for this purpose, it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. It just needs to be accurate to produce more true negatives than false negatives for it to be at least a useful first pass at trying to determine what it is that people think or know. Some of this research, I don't think Veritas itself, but other investigators have been funded by DARPA. As far as I know, the military is not yet using any technology like this in the field, largely because of concerns about accuracy. But even though I was a little dubious when I started this research project, and I thought, well, this is science fiction, but I'll think through the legal implications of science fiction. The technology is getting better and better, especially if you use multiple modalities. So now let's talk about fMRI, which you can combine with EEG and with a couple of other technologies like near-infrared fingerprinting and peripheral physiological measures. So fMRI is functional magnetic resonance imaging. MRI takes a structural picture of any part of your body, maybe an MRI of your knee. It certainly is used to take structural pictures of the brain. And then the functional component is that an fMRI machine can be used to measure changes in blood flow in the brain and the ways in which blood flow changes over time, from time 1 to time 2 when you're responding to a stimulus, can be mapped onto the structural picture that the fMRI takes, that the MRI machine takes initially. And so, let me flip ahead to, okay, so this, we'll come back to this slide, but here's the structural picture, and the colors overlaid on the structural picture tell us where there is relatively greater or lesser activity in particular regions of your brain when you are responding to a particular stimulus or performing a particular task. So the reason why that's interesting is that although our brains are not modular, it's not like one of those old phrenology models that says, well, love is here, and hate is here, and fairness is here, there is some localization to the way the brain performs functions. Your visual cortex is back here. If you see something, you're going to have activity in your visual cortex. And if you remember a visual memory, play a little movie clip in the brain, you're going to have activity in your visual cortex too. Vision is one of the most localized functions, but by using machine learning to categorize different patterns of brain activity, we can actually figure out relatively well what it is your brain is doing just by understanding which parts of your brain are becoming active. When particular regions of your brain become more active, that increases their oxygen consumption, its metabolic needs go up, therefore, in processes that are actually not very well understood, blood flow is selectively directed to those regions of the brain. That's called the hemodynamic response. And we can measure, using an MRI machine, where blood flow is increasing or decreasing in different regions of your brain, because oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood carries a different magnetic signature. So we use blood flow in different regions of the brain as a proxy for metabolic activity in those areas of the brain, which is a proxy for neuronal activity. So I just want to be very clear that when we are looking at the products of an fMRI, we're not looking at the activities of individual neurons. We're looking at the way neuronal activity changes demands on blood flow, which changes a magnetic signature, which can then be used to make activity maps of the brain. I am belaboring this point to some extent because the brain works really fast, and the hemodynamic response, the change in blood flow, is a bit slower. So there are things that the brain does that we cannot yet measure with fMRI. It's a fascinating tool, but it's certainly not a perfect one, and it's important to understand its limitations. So a person lies in an MRI machine. Let's see, there's a person going into an MRI machine. And we get the structural map. This is decomposed into voxels. A voxel is a volumetric pixel. And then we look at what is the activity of each voxel from time 1 to time 2. And we can use this both for information detection and for lie detection. So I'm going to use Professor Henry again as my example. Let's say we put her in that scanner that we just saw a picture of, and I show her this picture that's on your left. The lab of Dr. Gallant out of UC Berkeley has done some absolutely fascinating work. They showed hundreds of subjects, thousands upon thousands of images, and looked at what regions of the brain become active when they looked at those images. They showed them natural scenes, maybe Yosemite or some beautiful park, scenes with animals. They showed them urban scenes, waterways, dinners, offices, thousands of categories of thousands of scenes, and made databases of patterns of brain activity. How does the typical brain react when it sees this kind of scene? It turns out that we all pick out what is salient in that scene to us in very similar ways. So even though we're all individuals and every brain is individual, every single person in this room, probably, will process a scene of the interior of an office differently than a scene of Yosemite National Park. So now when I put Professor Henry in the scanner and I show her that picture, my pattern classifier, or Dr. Gallant's pattern classifier, can correctly predict almost 100% of the time that this is what she's looking at, without knowing what it is. The machine, the pattern classifier doesn't say, oh, there are 3 things she could be looking at, and it's most likely this one. It's from the whole universe of types of scenes that she could be looking at. And we can tell that by looking at this. This is, so we take our structural picture of the brain, this one, and we flatten it out. We take the crenellated cortex and we flatten it out and make sort of a map. And then we're going to see differential activity. Yellow is the areas of greatest activity. If she's looking at an office, a street, a plate of sandwiches, the national park, or the face of her daughter. And then we can guess what it is that she's looking at. So this is not necessarily that useful for law enforcement, because if somebody is currently looking at something, it's much better to just look at it yourself to figure out what it is than to look at her brain and try to reverse extrapolate what is the thing. But if we ask her to remember what it is that she just saw, we get something very similar. And so this technology is going to get us very close to memory detection, as long as the person is either willing to remember what we ask them to remember, or unable not to block their memory of it, which could happen if there is what I was describing as that prepotent response before you suppress the brain activity. So if I ask you right now, think of your mother's face, or the famous example, don't think of white bears. Now you all probably thought of a white bear. And I could probably tell that to a reasonable degree of certainty if you were in a scanner. Oh, she thought of white bears just now. Don't think about that crime scene. Now I know whether you thought about that crime scene or not. And if you haven't seen the crime scene, you weren't able to think about it, so I wouldn't have gotten a map of what it looked like. In case people want to do more reading here, just some further slides. The Gallant Lab has also been able to do image reconstruction, showed people thousands of clips of video, and then was able to read brain activity, and from the brain activity alone, crudely reconstruct what it was the person saw on the video clip, whether it was a person, a bird flying through the air, an airplane, or a cityscape. So that's information detection. What has this brain encoded? Can we read it back out of the brain? Actually, to some extent, yes, we can, which is somewhat mind-blowing to me, pardon the pun. And fMRI for lie detection picks up the difference between two states. This notion that I was talking about before, that activity is heightened in the lying condition. Now, there is no particular fMRI signature for lie versus truth per se. It's not as if there's a lying spot on the brain that lights up, although wouldn't investigators be thrilled if there were. But the idea is, and this is a commercial slide, this is a promotional slide for the no-lie MRI company, but it's not totally inaccurate. Areas in the prefrontal cortex that have to do with impulse inhibition, and in the anterior cingulate cortex, which have to do with mediating between conflicts, appear on average to become more active when a person is asked to tell a lie, or is given the free choice of whether to respond truthfully versus untruthfully to an investigator. Prefrontal cortex activity makes sense because it would be the suppression of the prepotent response, an inhibitory function, and activity in the anterior cingulate cortex also makes a certain amount of sense because that mediates between the conflict of whether to tell the truthful information that your brain is automatically prompting you with versus whether to tell the deceptive information. You would also see ACC activity when you're mediating between any kind of conflict. I want this sandwich, but I've already had two. I'd like to run this red light, but maybe I'll get caught. These would all generate greater anterior cingulate activity. The lie detection protocols are not yet particularly ecologically valid, but they do perform well in the lab. So, how and where might brain reading be an issue in the law? And what legal protections do or should exist for mental privacy? This is a little preliminary to talk about it because I don't think any of these technologies are good enough to, actually I'm certain none of these technologies are yet good enough to be used in a courtroom today and to pass the standard for scientific evidence under Federal Rule of Evidence 703, the Daubert test. But they could be good enough to be used in a whole host of other areas that aren't governed by the Federal Rules of Evidence. So here's some areas where brain reading could be of interest. Criminal investigations, investigating both parties and witnesses. Criminal defense, I swear it wasn't me, my brain will exonerate me. Sentencing, okay, this evidence isn't good enough to be admitted at trial, but now we'd like to know if this person plans to molest children again. Let's hook him up and find out how good the results are. Parole, what does this person's brain tell me about whether he's been as rehabilitated as he claims? And what are his real plans for after we release him, if we release him? Could be useful in civil litigation. Did this employer have any intent to discriminate? Or is it just statistical that they've never managed to promote a woman or minority into management? And civil litigation, certainly for the truthfulness of the plaintiff, too. Are you really in chronic back pain all the time the way you say you are? Because we're not so sure. Let's hook you up and find out. And also for threshold determinations in employment or for security clearance. Currently, there are federal laws preventing employers from using polygraph for these purposes, but there are no statutes that prevent the use of brain-based, non-polygraph technologies for these purposes. And I see that I've spent a long time talking about the technologies, so I'm going to spend the next less than 10 minutes or so talking about the Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues with the use of brain reading technologies. So our intuition might be our brains, our minds are sacrosanct and private. But it is unclear as a legal matter whether that's the case. So our two major criminal protections arise under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects us in the following way. It is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. As you can see, it's a balancing test. It's not an absolute protection, nor should it be. However, how do we do the balance? This only protects us from searches and seizures that are unreasonable. So what is a reasonable search or seizure? Reasonable is a culturally moving target. And we also might wonder, is the use of a brain reading technology a search? Is it a seizure? If it's a search or a seizure, is it a search of the person? Let's think about EEG technology. EEGs are reading the electrical signals that emanate from your brain. It is not actually a search inside your brain. There's nothing invasive about it. A blood test is a much more physically invasive search of the person. You have to stick a needle in somebody's arm. With EEG, you don't have to puncture the body. Your brain waves are emanating from you all the time. Now, what if I develop a little handheld remote detector and here, I can read your brain waves from 10 feet away. I haven't actually searched you. Do you have any reasonable expectation of privacy in your brain waves? If you do have an expectation of privacy in your brain waves today, it's because no one's been able to read them before. So we can all walk around thinking whatever thoughts we're thinking, secure in the knowledge that unless we start to chuckle to ourselves or something like that, nobody knows. So when we say an unreasonable search or seizure, the Supreme Court has pegged what is reasonable or unreasonable very closely to what is the typical person's so-called reasonable expectation of privacy. And our expectations of privacy change as technology changes. There used to probably be a reasonable expectation of privacy that if you have your blinds up in your house, maybe your neighbor can see into your house, but a person who's currently sitting in Hong Kong cannot. Now that Google, and I love Google Maps, and I use Google products all the time, so this is not intended to be a knock on Google, but now that Google has these street view cameras, driving down the street of every city in the world, making all those wonderful maps, what happens in my window at this moment could be perfectly visible in Hong Kong, and that's lawful because I haven't taken steps to keep it private. So as technology changes, what the law considers to be our reasonable expectation of privacy changes. There was a US Supreme Court case called Kyllo, or Kylo, K-Y-L-L-O. Is it Kylo? Kylo. Where law enforcement was using heat-sensitive technology to try to determine from the outside of somebody's house whether inside of the house they were growing marijuana plants. So they had one of these trucks parked in the street, and they're using their technology to try to make heat maps of the house. The heat maps were not very specific, and although I think Justice Scalia was very concerned about whether the heat signature would show a lady of the house taking a bath, it was really very non-specific laws. The court held that reading the heat signature that emanates from the building was an unreasonable search and seizure because even though the heat was emanating from the building and they didn't have to go into the building, just like our brainwaves are emanating from our heads, and I don't have to go into your head to collect the brainwaves, this kind of thermal signature technology is not widely in use. Because it's not widely in use, we reasonably expect that the heat signatures of our houses are not able to be read by other people. But that's a very insecure holding. If heat reading technology became popular and cheap and we all walked around with these sensors in our pockets, then we wouldn't have an expectation of privacy in that. That makes the ability to potentially read brainwaves insecure if it rests on this reasonableness holding. Reasonableness also depends on the body. What is it that is considered protected thought versus just physical stuff? And this takes us into the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment protects testimonial statements. You cannot be forced to incriminate yourself. I can't make you speak against yourself. I can make you speak about other stuff, I can make you speak about something that incriminates the person sitting next to you. And if you won't speak, I can put you in jail for contempt of court. But I can't make you speak against yourself. But I can draw your blood, and I can have your blood incriminate you. I can take a cheek swab and have your DNA incriminate you. I can take a picture of your face, because you publish your face to the world all the time, and have your image incriminate you. So one of the questions that will be important if this kind of technology continues to develop is, are the physical proxies of the information that your brain encodes more like testimonial statements or more like unprotected bodily products? So if a person is pulled over for driving drunk and refuses a blood test or breathalyzer test, he or she, and the state can show a compelling need for the information, pursuant to a subpoena, they can have their blood drawn against their will. But I cannot force them to say, yes, I was driving drunk and I had 16 shots of tequila before I got into my car. That would be somebody with extraordinary knowledge. But since fMRI or EEG is less invasive and electrical waves sound like physical stuff, on which side of the line would this fall? I think it's an open question. I would suggest that there is some precedent that would protect our thoughts more than treating them as the mere physiological proxies of thoughts would suggest. And this is because there is some precedent that protects information that has been evoked versus not evoked. So the theory behind why your blood or your DNA can be used against you is that law enforcement's taking of it doesn't change it. Your blood alcohol level was your blood alcohol level, whether it was measured by law enforcement or not. Whereas when you are forced to speak, one, that changes the contents of your mind somehow, so the government is intersecting with your mental liberty by making you produce thought and speech that you would not otherwise have done, and that there is something special about the mind, about this sphere of self-creation and of privacy. So I would suggest that when we are presenting somebody with information probes, is this familiar to you or not, to evoke the P300 wave, or with images in the fMRI machine to see if we get a hemodynamic response, does the blood flow in the brain change, we are altering the person physiologically in ways that did not support the basis for taking blood or cheek swabs or DNA information. But the more you press on that, the less secure that distinction becomes, because if we are true materialists, then at some point, everything we think and feel and are can be measured as a physiological substrate. But at least there are Fourth and Fifth Amendment protections in the criminal procedure context. The Fifth Amendment protects, again, as I mentioned, only you from incriminating yourself and has never protected you from incriminating your neighbor. What has protected you from incriminating your neighbor is the fact that if you say, I don't know, we have no way to prove that you do know, unless, you wrote some emails about it or something. But if I could put the Veritas helmet on you, then you can't choose not to be a witness anymore. Or you can't choose not to give evidence against the person who you would otherwise rather protect. In the open data context, people sometimes speak of privacy through obscurity, but once data and records become available, privacy through obscurity goes away. This may be the same kind of transformation for what had been our private thoughts, that secrecy or reticence through obscurity goes away once our brains become more transparent. Further, we have no Fourth and Fifth Amendment protections against, for example, using a voluntary brain scan to predict who might be a recidivist and therefore who ought to be denied parole. There's a really interesting paper by Aaron Aharoni, I think is at the Rand Institute, showing that degree of activity in the ACC strongly predicts likelihood of reoffense. I said the ACC mediates between conflict. The more activity you have in your anterior cingulate cortex, typically, the better you are at inhibiting your impulses and mediating between conflict. the less you see, the more likely the person is to be like, ah, conflict, what conflict? Sure, I'm going to take that thing from that store just because I want it. Prisoners have a diminished expectation of privacy in all kinds of ways. Even a person who's been arrested and not convicted can be subject to a full body cavity search just because concerns of safety are said to dictate, even if you're pulled over for a parking stop. So could we read prisoners' brains to figure out whether they're likely to reoffend? Employment. We have at-will employment. People can take screening tests or not, and if you opt not to take my screening test, I can opt not to hire you. I can't impose a polygraph test, but I can impose lots of other kinds of tests. And employment is, in fact, the market area where no-lie MRI is promoting itself. So I'm out of time, but here are some further articles along with the slide that was earlier in the presentation that has some wonderful work from the Gallant Lab from 2013. And with that, I will turn to questions. And if I'm seeing some of you later today at the Follows talk, and we're going to be talking about the same subject, so there will be plenty more time for questions then.
I hope I didn't word my question right, but I was wondering what your implications for always having the truth. I guess like if I want to like overemphasize it, I don't want to overemphasize too much, but it's like opening the Cartesian theater. And then you always know, you can get this technology that can really tell you what happened. And it may be able to like, be able to accurately sentence a criminal or something. And if you have law, sort of like technology kind of like moving the law around, instead of like the jury, or like, do you lose some of this humanism of being able to rationalize through things, and do you lose a little bit of humanism if you replace law with technology? That's what I'm saying.
It's a very deep question. So, no, that's good. So part of the theory, when you think about the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, the way in which judges interpret it and the strength that they give to it depends upon why they think it exists. So one account of why the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination exists is that we expect that people will lie in their own behalf. Why would you honestly say something that's self-incriminating? And so to protect the criminal process itself from extra and unnecessary lies, we just tell people, you don't have to say anything, because having them be silent is better than having them get up there and contaminate the process with all their lies. If that's why we think the privilege of self-incrimination exists, then if you get rid of lying, you have no problem anymore. And if the information that you get from the defendant is going to be 100%, but significantly truthful, and you're getting it right from the source about whether he was at the scene of the crime, pulled the trigger, or what have you, then we can have more accurate adjudications, and not only are we not losing anything, we're gaining a great deal. We might also avoid convictions of the innocent that way too. But if you have a different theory about why the Fifth Amendment exists, another prominent theory for why it exists is that there is something special and private about the inner self, and that forcing a person to speak is an unconscionable intrusion of the state upon one's most profound liberty to speak or not speak, to reveal oneself or not reveal oneself. Those are more humanistic dimensions about why privilege against self-incrimination might exist, even in a context where we really want as much good information as possible. And if we take that more humanistic view, we might say, all right, we recognize that there's a positive value to information production, but we also recognize that it comes at a cost. And at a certain point, we're going to balance that and say, we're willing to do without a certain amount of information so that we can permit people to have a sphere, an inner sphere of self-construction that is not taken away from them. And something similar informs the very limited First Amendment right not to speak. We usually think of the First Amendment as something that allows speech, protects speech, prevents Congress from passing any law that inhibits the ability to speak. But there's a limited First Amendment right against compelled speech, because if I compel you to speak, that takes away your liberty as well. And so there's a way in which we could view brain-based information detection and deception technologies as compelled speech. And so maybe we could look at the theory of the First Amendment, too, to inform where we could draw some boundaries of why it is that we would honor a right not to reveal oneself.
So so just what I'm trying to understand is there's a point in which either technology, but more accurate information, you can be more just and be sentenced accurately, versus I think some of the First Amendment and Fourth and Fifth about retaining some of the humanistic values. So there's a point where we have to be able to justify and is the technology worth it to remove some of our values?
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary, and I would also say, and this is a little aside from, I think, the heart of your question, that there is a difference between detecting information and then making forward-going predictions from it, and I would have more humanistic concerns on the prediction side, I think. So determining whether you have done X in the past, if X is criminal, I think it's a harder case to say that you have a right to conceal that information that is unlawful and where your unlawful conduct could potentially be a risk to the rest of us, and where we can detect that information with certainty. But prediction is another matter. I might be able to say, Mr. Smith didn't pass the test when we asked him, have you ever seen child pornography? Now we know that at some point he saw child pornography. That doesn't mean that Mr. Smith is going to be a child molester and ought to be put under surveillance for the rest of his life, or ought to be limited from certain kinds of employment opportunities going forward. And in this way, there are some parallels to DNA. We all have genetic predispositions to something. That doesn't mean that that's going to ripen into the full-fledged condition itself, and so we protect genetic information so that insurance companies and employers don't make adverse ex-ante decisions that are risk-fearing, that would keep people out of the sphere of employment and public participation and impose social stigma. We may have neurological predispositions that could make us some percentage more likely to engage in certain behavior, like ACC activity and recidivism. And we could use information in the brain about past behavior to make those predictions, but those predictions are inherently uncertain. And this notion of humanistic freedom, I think, is at its most compelling when we're talking about forward-going degrees of liberty.
We have time for one last question, if there are any. Karen?
I just ask you, and you were talking about polygraph versus this new technology, and most of those are in the situation, I guess, of state statutes that prevent it. But doing sort of, that was old technology, this is new technology. And you're making the point that none of the states specifically address whether this new technology would also be prohibited.
Right.
So it is prohibited until we say it's not, or do you think if applied it would actually not be prohibited because it would be deemed unconstitutional?
I think it is currently not prohibited until there is action that does prohibit it, because the polygraph statutes prohibit polygraph. They don't prohibit the use of, they were not written with the same kind of foresight as, for example, our IP laws that talk about any medium now in use or future invented for the recording and storage of information that could cover everything from Betamax cassette tape to beaming information to the cloud. So the polygraph statutes wouldn't protect a person from an employer saying, please take this fMRI-based lie detection test.
But the rationale for it was basically us not believing in the quality of the data
Correct.
as opposed
Correct.
to the rights of the individual.
Precisely, yes. Now, the opposition, it's always tricky to talk about legislative intent, right? Because the legislature is a corporate body with lots of competing interests. The polygraph statutes, I think, were primarily inspired by concerns about accuracy, but not exclusively. There are some concerns about basic liberty in there too. But when the technology becomes significantly more accurate, it's harder to make the case that the liberty interest ought to bar it. And people will always talk about the ticking time bomb scenario. Oh, what, you're the terrorist who knows where the ticking time bomb is. I don't think that's ever happened. Maybe it's the kidnapper who knows where the victim is. But that, I think, just makes the case for the state's need more compelling under the Fourth Amendment. I don't think that needs to provide a blanket authorization for all instances of the uses of these technologies. But I think there's a real legal gap. And Hank Greeley and Judy Ellis wrote an article, a couple of years ago, where they said that there's an urgent need for regulation in this area. And I agree with them, and currently there hasn't been any regulation.
Join me in thanking Professor Putilnik.